Welcome to the Burnout Recovery Podcast, a guiding resource dedicated to healthcare professionals on their journey to overcoming burnout. Spearheaded by Dr. Joe Braid, a certified professional coach and rehabilitation physician.
Welcome back to the Burnout Recovery Podcast. This is episode number 153, dropping at the end of October 2025. And this actually is right around my 3-year podcast anniversary. Yeah, I do love celebrating. Yes, it was the 150th episode just a few weeks back, and now we are at the 3-year mark already. Pretty incredible and amazing with that consistent application of imperfectly showing up and bringing a podcast to your ears every week. So this year also marks 23 years of being a doctor, and I wanted to refer back to some really early experiences I had as a junior doctor and culture, toxicity in the workplace that really is quite well imprinted in my brain. I was 24 years old when I finished med school in the UK, and I remember being on my first rotation, which was in medicine at Nottingham Medical School or University Hospital, and I've got my stethoscope swinging around my neck and my white coat that we did still wear back in those days, and this absolute sense of awe that I'm finally here. I'm actually a doctor. I'm part of this system I've dreamed about joining for years. You know, it certainly doesn't happen, the getting into medicine and becoming a doctor gig. And the first few weeks were really everything I'd imagined. It was challenging, exhausting, but also really exhilarating. There was so much learning, seeing patients with conditions I'd really often only read about in textbooks and actually feeling like you were helping people. And it felt great and where I was supposed to be at this stage in my career. And during that medical rotation, I was working, of course, in a hierarchical team. And I remember the senior house officer that I worked with was a challenging individual to work with. So they were 1 year ahead of me in the English system. So literally they were probably 12 or 14 months into being a doctor themselves. And this person, let's call them Dr. Mitchell, certainly not their real name, was brilliant. Absolutely no questions about that. And she knew everything. She could diagnose complex cases relatively easily and quickly, and certainly had the respect of the consultants as well. But there was also this edge of bitterness, cynicism, and I could feel the hierarchy from the day that I started. And, you know, you just know you're smaller. Somebody's trying to make you feel small in that very level-based system that you're in. And I remember one time we were doing ward rounds and I was carrying this thick patient file. Yes, we used to wheel around trolleys. It was not the computer on wheels. Oh no, it was like 10 to 20 patient files stacked in the trolley. Old paper files that were held together with metal clips. And, you know, I was still a bit nervous trying to keep up with the rapid pace of the round when the clip came undone and the entire file exploded. Pages went everywhere, scattered across the corridor, sliding under beds, floating down like confetti. So that's a really great moment as the junior doctor when you then have to try and gather everything up, my face burning up with embarrassment. I go red at the drop of a hat, certainly did in that scenario. And my senior house officer standing there with her arms crossed, slowly shaking her head with this exaggerated eye roll that seemed to last forever. And some very sarcastic comment was made, that's what they're sending us from medical school now. And, you know, yeah, I find it so hard to sort of think back to that's how some of the interactions were in the workplace back then. But really, that moment set the tone for everything that followed. Now what I know about burnout, I can see the classic drivers of burnout were there. We were working 80 to 100 hours a week, and that is high workload and pressure at its most extreme. I remember calculating once that I was spending more time at the hospital than at home, including sleep. And then, you know, I never expected to have heaps of control as a junior doctor. However, that is another one of the drivers of burnout, and the lack of control were things like every decision certainly had to be approved by somebody above me. So I had to have that interaction with the other people, the other team members in the hierarchy. You know, if I wanted to put in routine labs in those first few months of being a junior doctor, I had to have that checked by somebody else. And then there was this sense of being micromanaged by other people in the team, how I write down my notes, how I speak to patients and their families. And it was just a tough time back then. Work-life balance was not very existent with the role that I had in the National Health Service. I didn't actually live in the hospital, but I lived on site in a unit with a friend from med school. So I was never far away. And then you miss those birthdays and family dinners, sometimes weddings as well, and losing that boundary between work and life, just disappearing completely. Let's talk about recognition, because that's a risk factor or a burnout driver as well. No matter how hard I worked or how many hours I put in or how much I learned, it was never really acknowledged by the team. Mistakes were more likely to be highlighted, but success went unnoticed. And you can then start to feel you're invisible unless you're actually doing something wrong. So you can see how the tables are turning in this kind of environment. The uncertainty was constant, and what we were told to focus on often changed. Let's get really efficient this week, and then the next time, let's get very thorough with all the patient notes. And so then it's really hard to know if you're meeting expectations or not, because if people haven't clarified what expectations are, you're just making it up in your own head of what it might be. But the toxic behaviours, that was what was really tough to be around. Eye rolls, sarcastic comments, public humiliation when you make a mistake. And it wasn't just one person. There were other people around who I saw doing this and witnessed doing this as well. And it was seen to be as like toughening up the juniors. And then when you're in that environment, so that can be with these dismissive comments being put around, you might start doing that yourself as well. And I'd noticed that from time to time, I might do an eye roll, or I might make some sarcastic comments about other people's inexperience, or I started complaining about the workload, about the patients, about how other people seem to be managing in the workplace. And in the doctor's mess, in the corridors during handovers, every conversation seemed to be about what was wrong. These patients don't appreciate what we do, or HR or the junior medical officer management team don't know what it's like being on the ground. And I just thought this was how medicine worked. You know, I could already hear echoes of this when I was a medical student, but then once you're really in it, you're signing your name to everything, you're part of the team, not so much floating as you do as a medical student. Cynicism was really a sign of experience, that complaining showed that you were tough enough to handle the reality of healthcare. And we were all working these impossible hours, barely sleeping, living on coffee and adrenaline, and wearing it like a badge of honor. So looking back, I was probably experiencing burnout. I just didn't know what it was back then. We didn't really talk about mental health or your well-being. We just talked about toughening up. And the toxic behavior ended up looking like a kind of survival behavior. You're overwhelmed, you're feeling undervalued, you don't have control over your shifts or your circumstances, and putting others down becomes a way to feel some sense of power. And it was how we coped with an impossible system that was systematically breaking us down. But really, I was then losing myself. I was no longer the enthusiastic, compassionate person who'd entered medicine. I was being replaced by someone cynical and harsh. And I was perpetuating the same toxic culture that had initially shocked me. So I then worked out what I might do for the next year. So back then we just did 1 year as a junior house officer, and then we can make a decision as to whether to stay on and do further training in the UK, or maybe nip over to the Antipodes, where lots of people went and do a year or two there before returning back to the UK to do training. And I can't say that back then I had the mindset and awareness that I do now. However, I could see that this would be a complete reset and a real start over and work in a different system, that had some similarities to the UK, but it was a fresh restart. And I made the move, I guess, 22 years ago. I arrived here August 2003. And I changed from about 100-hour weeks to 40-hour weeks. And it felt like stepping into a different universe. Suddenly, I had control over my schedule. I had some recognition for my work. There were clear expectations. And then I also had time to remember why I'd chosen medicine in the first place. And I guess I tried to do a do-over of being the colleague I wish I had been for others around me in my teams in the UK. And, supporting others when I noticed they felt overwhelmed rather than intimidating them or giving a bonus eye roll. And so toxic workplace culture is often created where there's people under impossible pressure trying to survive in broken systems. And when all the drivers of burnout are present, that is excessive workload, lack of control, poor work-life balance, no recognition, constant uncertainty and toxic behaviours, even some of the most compassionate people can become part of the problem. The good news is things can change and you can be part of the change there. And so that junior doctor I used to be, the one who was so excited to be finally part of the medical profession, she's still here. It just took moving halfway around the world and finding a system that didn't systematically break people down to find me again and then keep evolving and working on avoiding burnout and knowing how to address it. So burnout proofing my life and recognizing some of those drivers of burnout in the workplace. So I've got a few reflective questions to leave you with at the end of today's podcast episode. Think about what energy are you bringing to your workplace conversations and how might that be affecting your colleagues? Are you unconsciously contributing to a culture of cynicism because you're struggling with your own burnout? And if so, what's one small change you could make this week to break that cycle? Because here's the truth. We're all just trying to survive in definitely challenging systems, but we can choose to survive together with compassion and support rather than tearing each other down. Have a great week. I'll catch up with you next week. Ready to take the next step in your burnout recovery journey? Visit drjobraid.com for free resources, all 150 plus podcast episodes, and information about my keynote speaking. Links are in the show notes. Your well-being matters. Protect the asset that is you.